Sorry, I forgot what I wanted to say. In 1776, a Scottish economist called Adam Smith wrote a book called The Nature and Causes of the Wealth of Nations, which laid the foundations of economics as we understand today. Later, in the 18th century, economists like John Baptist Say, J.S. Mill propagated Adam Smith's ideas. As this economist led the foundations of economics, we call them as classical economists, and the economic thought that they promoted came to be known as the classical school of thought. Now, we could talk a lot about the classical school of thought as well as the classical economists, but for now, we need to only understand the fact the classical school of thought was based on mainly three ideas. They are, first, that the aggregate supply in the economy will always beat the aggregate demand. Second, that the economy is always in full employment. And third, that there shouldn't be any government intervention in the economy. That is, they proposed the idea of free markets. In the 1700s as well as the 1800s, all the European nations as well as the United States of America followed the footsteps or the ideas of these classical economists. However, during the 1930s, especially in 1929, the ideas of these economists were put to test. It was because the United States of America was hit by a major catastrophe, the Great Depression. It was at this time that an English economist called John Maynard Keynes came into the picture and heavily criticized this classical school of thought, especially the three ideas that we discussed earlier. Keynes, in his 1936 book, The General Theory of Employment, Interest and Money, wrote that the classicals have always taught us that supply creates its own demand, which is referred to as the Say's law in all of the modern texts that we read today. Supply creates its own demand? What were the classicals even thinking when they said something like this? If that was true, then I would just open up a factory and start supplying goods. And because the quantity that I supply will always meet the quantity that is demanded in the market, I would just get rich in a few months. You see the point? Keynes was right. The classicals proposed a thought which was completely irrational. Or was it? What if the classicals were right? What if Keynes just misinterpreted what the classicals wanted to say? The saying, supply creates its own demand, is not found in any of the classical texts. However, similar sayings like aggregate supply always equals aggregate demand is found in the works of J.S. Mill and J.B. Say. As one can see, the classicists were the propagators of supply-side economics. But then Keynes came in and said, hey, listen, it isn't the supply in the economy that drives growth, but it's the demand. The greater the aggregate demand, the more the growth possible. Before understanding or getting the gist of what the Keynesian idea of economic growth was, we need to understand what demand actually means. So demand can be defined or segregated into three parts: the desire for a commodity, the willingness to pay for the commodity, and the ability to pay for the commodity. Now, let's forget the willingness to pay for the commodity and desire for the commodity. Let's look at the ability to pay for a commodity. Unless and until I have the ability to pay, that is money in my pocket, I cannot go and demand a commodity. Now, keeping this concept in mind, let us understand or let us get a gist of what Keynes' idea for economic growth was. Now, Keynes came up with an idea where he said that it is the aggregate demand in the economy which actually pushes the aggregate supply, which means it is the demand in the economy which forces the companies in the economy to supply their commodities. And as companies start supplying their commodity and the demand is being met, what happens is the company starts profiting out of it. Out of these profits, the company starts to expand its business, which then generates employment for the people in an economy. More profits as well as more employment means that the governments can now collect more amount of taxes in the economy. The collection of these taxes are then redistributed back in the economy in the form of subsidies. As one can see, how a single factor of demand has had a chain effect which eventually has led to economic growth. Now, we have a gist of what the Keynesian theory of growth was. But do we really understand what the classicists wanted to say when they said something similar to supply creates its own demand? What the classicals actually wanted to say when they said something similar to supply creates its own demand is that a person's ability to produce is what gives him the ability to demand in the market. What I mean by this, so if I were to give you an example, think about this. I am a professor of economics in a college. It's the ability to produce the teaching service which helps me get my salary. And because I get my salary in my hand, I can go out and demand for different things. Without my ability to produce the service of teaching, I will never be able to demand things outside in the market. Without my ability to produce, my ability to demand wouldn't exist in the market. The classicists were of the view that supply should always come before demand, and the people in the society who are not willing to supply their services or products should not demand for products or services either. The classicals propagated an idea that said that it is the economist's ability to produce which creates wealth. It's the production that should always come before consumption. To understand where the classical school of thought went right and where J.M. Keynes' idea of economic growth might lead to overproduction of resources or overconsumption of resources in an economy, you need to see part 2 of this video. Thank you for watching the video, guys. Please subscribe and click on the bell icon so that you can stay updated about my videos.